I'd been with Maureen for 3 years when I found the message that changed everything. Not in the dramatic way you might imagine. No shouting. No plates thrown across the kitchen. No door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Just me, standing in the hallway of our house in Tauranga on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, holding her phone because she'd asked me to check if her sister had confirmed dinner on Saturday. And there it was. A message from a contact saved as Work Clifton. Hope your oblivious old bloke doesn't start asking questions. Can't wait for Thursday. Don't forget what you promised. I read it twice. Then a third time. Then I put the phone face down on the hall stand, walked to the kitchen, filled the jug, and stood there, listening to it boil. I want you to understand something about being 63 years old and reading a message like that. It's not the same as being 30. When you're young and something like this happens, the grief is enormous, but it sits on top of a life that still has decades of possibility underneath it. When you're past 60, it lands differently. You've already buried friends. You've watched your body start making small negotiations with age. You've given years real, finite years to someone, and you thought, genuinely believed, that the arithmetic of your remaining time was sorted. You thought you knew who you were going home to. I'd been married before. My first wife, Carol, passed away from cancer 11 years ago. We had 31 good years together. 2 sons, both grown now, living in Christchurch and Melbourne, and a life that I still look back on with nothing but gratitude and grief in equal measure. After she died, I didn't think I'd ever want to be with anyone again. Not because I was dramatic about it, just because I genuinely couldn't imagine it. Then I met Maureen at a friend's retirement do in Hamilton. She was 61, recently divorced, sharp sense of humor, loved tramping, hated rugby but tolerated it for social reasons, made the best cheese scones I'd ever eaten. We took things slowly, very slowly. A year of dinners and weekends away, before she suggested we look at moving in together. Another year before I used the word fiancé, and even then, we hadn't set a date. The boys liked her. My sister liked her. I thought I was lucky. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. Then I picked up my own phone and texted her she was in the bedroom and said the jug had boiled. Did she want a tea? She came out in her dressing gown, and I handed her her phone and asked if she'd heard back from her sister yet. She looked at the screen, said not yet, poured herself a tea. We watched the news. She fell asleep on the couch. I sat next to her and looked at her face and tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't say anything. Not that night. I know a lot of people reading this or listening, if you've come to this from the channel, will think that's strange. Why not confront her immediately? Why drag it out? I've thought about that question a lot, and the honest answer is that I needed to know more before I said a single word. Because if I said something that night, based on one message I'd seen for 3 seconds, she could explain it away. She was smart enough. She'd say it was a joke, or a misunderstanding, or that Clifton was a colleague who had a sense of humor I didn't understand. And I'd be left either backing down and feeling humiliated, or doubling down without enough to stand on. I'm 63 years old. I've been a quantity surveyor for 35 years. I'm not a reactive man. I wanted the full picture before I moved, so I waited. The next morning, a Wednesday, I told her I had an early site visit and left the house at 5:30. I didn't. I drove to the waterfront, sat in my car, and thought clearly for the first time since I'd seen that message. Clifton. I knew the name from her work. She managed contracts for a commercial property firm in the city, and Clifton was, I was fairly sure, the firm's principal. Early 50s. She'd mentioned him in passing a handful of times, not in a way that had ever registered as suspicious, just as a workplace name. I thought about what I knew. They worked closely together. She'd been working later than usual over the past 2 months, something I'd attributed to a big tender she said they were preparing. She'd started sleeping with her phone face down, which I'd noticed, but not thought twice about. And 3 weeks ago, on a Friday, she'd come home later than expected and smelled faintly of wine. And when I asked, she said the team had gone for a quick drink to celebrate the tender going in. I'd said great, and made her a plate of leftovers. I am not a paranoid man. I genuinely hadn't been suspicious before that message. And now I was sitting in a car park at 6:30 in the morning, trying to reconstruct the past 2 months through an entirely different lens. I didn't install anything on her phone. I want to be clear about that, both because it matters ethically and because, honestly, I wouldn't have known how. What I did was much simpler. I paid attention in a way I hadn't been paying attention before. I started noticing when she went to bed earlier than me, taking her phone with her. I noticed that she'd started locking it. Not aggressively. Just a habit that hadn't been there before. I noticed that when a message came through and she picked it up, she angled the screen slightly away from me. Small things. Things you could explain individually. Things that, together, painted something else. On the Thursday of that first week, the Thursday that Clifton's message had mentioned, she told me she'd be home late again. Another work dinner, she said. A client from Auckland who'd specifically asked that she attend. I said, of course, no problem. I'd sort myself out for dinner. I want to pause here and tell you something about that conversation. There was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, where she looked at me, and I could see her watching my face for any sign that I knew something, and I gave her nothing. I just smiled and said I'd probably do lamb chops and watch the league. She relaxed. She kissed me on the cheek and left at 4. I did make the lamb chops. I did watch the league. And I thought, very carefully, about what I actually wanted out of what was coming. I wasn't certain yet. I told myself that. But I was close enough to certain that I needed to decide. Was I going to walk away quietly, or was I going to understand the full scope of what had been happening before I did? I chose to understand it first. Over the following fortnight, I pieced it together the way I do with a complex build, methodically, patiently, without emotion clouding the process. I had access to our shared calendar, which she'd barely thought about in terms of privacy because we'd set it up purely for logistics. Doctor's appointments, her son's visits, my fishing weekends, but she'd started adding vague entries, see, planning Metergy late, work, dinner. TBC and I began cross-referencing these with her actual movements. I also, and I'm not proud of this, but I'm not ashamed of it either, called an old mate of mine who works in commercial property on the North Shore and asked, casually, what he knew about Clifton's firm. He told me plenty. Clifton had a reputation, not a secret one apparently. It was fairly well known in the industry. He was 54, separated from his wife of 20 years. Known for forming close mentoring relationships with women who worked for him. My mate used air quotes that I could practically hear through the phone. 2 weeks in, I knew enough. She wasn't just having an affair, she'd been lying to me consistently, specifically, and with considerable effort for at least 2 months. The late nights, the Auckland client who didn't exist, the Friday wine that wasn't with the team, all of it had been Clifton. And when I thought back further, I suspected it had started even before the 2 months I could trace. There was a weekend conference in Wellington in March that she'd said was mandatory. I dropped her at the airport. I wondered now whether he'd been on the same flight. I also discovered, and this was the part that genuinely winded me, that she'd discussed me with him. I found this out not through any electronic surveillance, but through the most old-fashioned method possible, a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. It was a Saturday morning. She was in the backyard on a call, and I was in the kitchen with the ranch slider open a few inches for the breeze. I wasn't eavesdropping deliberately. I was just there, making toast, and I heard my name. Not my actual name, She called me the old boy. As in, the old boy's been pretty easy to manage. He just believes whatever I tell him. Then a laugh. Then, he's sweet. But honestly, Cliff, he has no idea. I put the toast down. I stood very still, and I listened to my fiancée tell her lover that I was easy to manage, that I had no idea, that I was sweet in the way you might describe a slow dog. And right then, something in me went very quiet and very clear. I made a decision in that moment that I've never regretted. I was not going to walk out of this quietly. I was not going to let her manage the narrative the way she'd been managing me. I was going to wait for the right moment. And I was going to make sure that when it came, she understood exactly what had happened and exactly who she'd underestimated. I want to be clear. This wasn't about revenge in some petty, vindictive sense. I'm too old for that, frankly. It was about dignity. It was about making sure that the last chapter of this story was written on my terms, not hers. I spent the next 3 weeks being the most agreeable, unbothered partner you've ever seen in your life. I brought her coffee in the mornings. I asked about her day. When she said she'd be late, I said no problem. When she mentioned Clifton's name, in a sentence which she still did, occasionally, because she thought I had no idea, I nodded pleasantly and asked a follow-up question, like a man who had nothing on his mind but moderate professional interest. I helped her plan a weekend visit from her daughter in Wellington. I suggested we look at a holiday to the South Island in spring. She thought she was managing me. She thought she was so far ahead. She had no idea that I'd already spoken to a lawyer. I'd rung my solicitor, a woman I've known since she handled Carol's estate, and explained the situation. I wanted to know exactly where I stood. We weren't married. The house was mine. Purchased before Maureen moved in. Her name was on none of the utilities. She had no legal claim to anything in my life, which was a relief, but also meant there was nothing dramatic to untangle. My solicitor was kind about it. She said these situations were more common than people thought, and that my position was straightforward. When I was ready to end things, I could simply end them. I wasn't ready yet. I was still waiting. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived on a Friday evening in early June. Her daughter, a lovely young woman who'd driven up from Wellington for the weekend, was with us for dinner. Maureen's son had video called in from Dunedin. We were all at the table, eating a roast I'd made, having what looked for all the world like a warm family dinner. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, and I watched her face. It was a fraction of a second, a micro-expression. The tiniest flicker of pleasure, the involuntary kind, the kind you can't control, and then she turned her phone face down and said it was nothing. Just work. Her daughter glanced at me. I don't know if she saw anything in my face. I hope not. After dinner, I offered to clean up and encouraged Maureen to take her daughter for a walk along the esplanade before it got dark. They left. I stood in the kitchen and thought, this is the night. I wasn't going to confront her with accusations. I wasn't going to shout. I was going to show her exactly what I knew, in my own way, on my own terms, and I was going to do it in a manner that left no room for management, no space for her to reframe it, no version of events where I was the oblivious old bloke who'd believed whatever she told him. When she came back, her daughter went to bed early, long drive, she said. It was just the two of us at the kitchen table. She poured herself a wine and asked if I wanted one. I said I was fine with tea. She asked how I thought the evening had gone. I said I thought it had gone well. I said it was nice to see her daughter. I said I'd enjoyed the roast. Then I said, Maureen, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, not guilt yet, just alertness. The look of someone who's been carrying a secret for a long time and has just heard a tone of voice they weren't expecting. Of course, she said. I said, how long have you been with Clifton? She didn't answer immediately. That pause, 3, maybe 4 seconds, told me everything I'd needed confirmed. Then she said his name, like a question. Clifton? The way people do when they're buying time. Testing how much you actually know. I said, I heard you on the phone in the backyard. 8 weeks ago. You called me the old boy. You said I had no idea and that I believed everything you told me. She went pale. I said, I want you to know that I've had 8 weeks to sit with that. I've been to a lawyer. I understand my position clearly, and tonight I need you to be honest with me because I think you owe me at least that. And she was honest. I'll give her that. Once the pretense was gone, she didn't keep fighting it. She told me it had started about 5 months ago. She told me she hadn't meant for it to become what it became. She told me she cared about me, that this wasn't about me failing her in some way, that Clifton had just, and here she searched, for a word appeared at a point when she'd been feeling uncertain about the future. I asked her what she meant by uncertain about the future. She said she'd been thinking about whether this us was really where she was headed for the rest of her life. Whether the life we'd been building was what she actually wanted. I said, then why didn't you just tell me that, instead of doing this? She didn't have a good answer. I didn't expect one. I told her that I needed her to move out. I told her I wasn't interested in a conversation about working through it. Not because I was making a hasty decision, but because I'd had 8 weeks to think about it. And I was certain. I said I'd give her 2 weeks to arrange where she was going, and that I'd stay out of her way while she packed. She started to say something I'm not sure what it was going to be, possibly an appeal of some kind. I didn't let her finish. I said, you told him I was easy to manage. I hope you understand now that I wasn't. I was just patient. She didn't say anything after that. I got up, rinsed my cup, and went to bed. Her daughter found out the next morning. I heard them talking through the wall. Maureen's voice low and tight. Her daughter's progressively less so. The daughter came and found me in the garage where I was reorganizing some shelving, and she said she was sorry, that she hadn't known. I believed her. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, you deserve better than this. I thanked her for that. It means something when someone who has no obligation to say it says it anyway. Maureen was gone within 10 days. She moved into a serviced apartment in the city. I found out later that she didn't go to Clifton immediately, which surprised me slightly. Perhaps that relationship had its own complications once the real world pressed in. Perhaps the version of her life that had seemed exciting at a distance looked different up close once mine was no longer the stable backdrop against which it played out. I don't know what happened to them. I haven't asked. What I do know is what happened to me. And I want to be honest about that part too. Because I think it's the part that gets left out of these stories. The weeks after she left were genuinely hard. Not in an angry way, the anger had mostly burned through during those 8 weeks of waiting. Hard in a quieter, more persistent way. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark and think about the arithmetic of my life. The years I'd given, the years I had left, the question of whether I'd made a fundamental miscalculation somewhere. I thought about Carol. I thought about my boys. I cooked for one, which after years of cooking for two has a particular silence to it. I called my older son one Sunday and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "Dad, I know this hurts, but can I tell you something? I always thought there was something a bit off. She was always slightly performing. Like she was always aware of how she seemed. I hadn't noticed that at the time. I filed it away. My younger son flew over from Melbourne for a weekend. We went fishing out of Tauranga Harbor. We didn't talk about Maureen much. We talked about a lot of other things. It was exactly what I needed. There's a particular kind of repair that happens in those ordinary moments, the ones that have nothing to do with the wound and everything to do with reminding you that the wound isn't the whole of your life. I'm writing this Telling this, I suppose, from a place of distance now. Not so much time that the edges have completely softened, but enough that I can see the shape of it clearly. Here's what I've come to believe. At 63, about what happened. Maureen's deception wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a kind of theft. When she kept up the pretense, the loving dinners, the plans for the South Island holiday, the hand held on the couch while we watched the news, she was taking something from me without my consent. She was taking my time, my presence, my real belief that we were building something genuine. And she was spending it on a double life while letting me think I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That's not a small thing. At 63, you don't get those months back. But I also believe this. The people who are easy to manage in the way she described me, the people who are trusting, who take their partners at their word, who don't interrogate every late night or phone screen or offhand mention of a colleague, those people aren't fools. They're not oblivious. They're choosing, consciously or not, to build a relationship on a foundation of good faith. That's not a weakness. It's a fundamental act of generosity. And when someone exploits that generosity, the failure is entirely theirs. I did not become less trusting after this. I made a deliberate decision about that, because if I let her convert me into a suspicious, watchful, closed-off man, then she'd taken something from me that no one had the right to take. The capacity for good faith is not naivete. It's a choice. I chose to keep making it. I also want to say something about patience, because I suspect some people who've heard this story have wondered about those 8 weeks. Whether it was unhealthy to stay silent that long, whether I should have just confronted her immediately and been done with it. Maybe. I can't tell you with certainty that my way was the only way, or even the best way. What I can tell you is that for me, those 8 weeks served a purpose. They gave me time to move through the initial shock without making irreversible decisions from inside it. They gave me time to understand the full scope of what had happened. They gave me time to get proper advice and arrive at my own position rather than reacting to hers. And they meant that when the conversation finally came, I wasn't a man falling apart. I was a man who'd already done his grieving, quietly, and knew exactly what he wanted to say. She'd called me oblivious. She thought I had no idea. I think what actually happened is that she mistook calmness for ignorance. That's a mistake people make about older men. Sometimes they assume that because we don't react loudly or immediately, we haven't noticed. But 63 years of life teaches you something important. There's almost never a good reason to speak before you're ready. I want to close with something for anyone going through something similar. Doesn't matter your age. Doesn't matter the details. If you discover your partner has been deceiving you, give yourself time before you do anything. Not forever. But enough time to move from the hot center of the shock into a cooler, clearer place. Get advice from people you trust, a lawyer if there's anything practical at stake, a friend if you need to be heard, your own counsel if you can trust it. Don't let your first response define the whole situation. And then when you're ready, and you know what you want to say, and you're standing in front of the truth without flinching, say it plainly. Without performance. Without cruelty. Just clearly as a person who knows their own worth. Because that's the thing about being called oblivious, or easy to manage, or clueless. There's a gift buried inside it if you're patient enough to find it. When the moment finally comes, you're the only one in the room who isn't surprised. I went fishing again the following weekend. Just me, the harbor, the early morning cold, and a thermos of tea that I'd made badly, but drunk anyway. A gray morning that turned golden by 9 o'clock the way Tauranga sometimes does in winter, and I sat on the stern and thought, I am still here. I am still myself. That has to be enough to begin with. It was. I've thought about the word oblivious a lot since all of this happened. It's an interesting word to have applied to you by someone who shared your bed, your kitchen, your plans for the future. Maureen said it to Clifton like it was a settled fact, like it was simply what I was, the defining quality of the man she'd been living with. The old boy who has no idea. What I've come to understand is that there's a cost to every choice a person makes, and it doesn't always arrive immediately. Sometimes it arrives quietly, weeks later, in the form of a man sitting at his own kitchen table who knows considerably more than you assumed. The cost of Maureen's choices didn't arrive the night she first lied to me, or the morning I heard her on the phone in the backyard. It arrived on a Friday evening in June, when she realized, mid-sentence, that the person she'd been managing hadn't been managed at all. That's what I mean when I say actions carry their own weight forward. Not in any mystical sense. Just the plain, observable truth that choices made in private don't stay private forever, and that the habits of character you build, honesty or deception, care or carelessness, eventually determine the shape of the life you end up with. Maureen chose, repeatedly, over 5 months, to deceive someone who had offered her nothing but good faith. The consequence of that choice was entirely proportionate. She lost that good faith, irretrievably, and the stable life she'd been using as a backdrop while she decided what she really wanted. I didn't plan any of that. I just refused to be rushed. I think the most important thing I did during those 8 weeks, and I want to be clear that I'm not holding myself up as any kind of model. I made plenty of mistakes in how I processed all of it privately, was to insist on my own clarity before I acted. Not out of some cold strategic calculation, but because I've lived long enough to know that decisions made in the first 48 hours of shock are rarely your best ones. Grief makes you want to do something, anything, immediately. Wisdom is the practice of sitting with that urge until it becomes something you can actually use. There's a kind of intelligence that only comes through time and difficulty, and I don't think you can shortcut it. You can be book smart at 30. You can't be this kind of smart at 30. This kind of smart comes from watching things fall apart and then watching them, slowly, become something else. It comes from losing Carol and still getting up the next morning. It comes from knowing, at 63, that your own equilibrium is the most important thing you have, and that no one, not a partner, not a betrayal, not a message you were never supposed to see, gets to take that from you permanently unless you hand it over. What I'd say to anyone in a similar position is simply this: your patience is not the same as your ignorance. Your calmness is not the same as your weakness. And the people who mistake those things, who look at a quiet, steady person and see someone they can manage, have made a fundamental error in judgment that will, eventually, be corrected. You don't need to correct it loudly. You just need to be ready when the moment comes. I went fishing the weekend after Maureen left. Cold morning, bad tea. Golden light by 9. I sat on the stern and thought about Carol, and about my boys, and about the fact that I was still entirely myself. That's not nothing. At 63, after everything, still being entirely yourself is, in fact, quite a lot.